I've come to the California desert to talk with Jim Kenna, Field Manager of the Bureau of Land Management's Palm Springs office. Well, thanks for talking with us, Jim.
Oh, glad to have you here. Welcome to the Oricopia Mountains Wilderness.
Thank you. Looks a little different than the last wilderness we came to.
Oh, I'll bet it does. I understand it was snowing last time.
It was.
You won't get that here.
I'm glad. I'm not talking just about the climate, though. We were talking with Anne-Marie LaRosa of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The wilderness that she stewards is measured in millions of acres, and there are perhaps a few thousand people within 100 miles. But here, we're talking about a wilderness measured in thousands of acres, and there are millions of people within 100 miles.
That's literally true. The area that I manage has 1.7 million acres, but it also has 24 million people living in it. We've got 11 wilderness areas in that 1.7 million acres and 678,000 acres in wilderness.
So you have a lot of different responsibilities, not just wilderness.
With so many people living in Southern California, there are a number of community services that we're engaged in. But when it boils right back down to basics, we're managing wilderness under the same law, the Wilderness Act.
And despite all that, you still manage wilderness with the same 4 cornerstones that someone would if they had one large wilderness.
That's absolutely true.
All right, so let's talk about those cornerstones. Our first one was to manage wilderness as a whole. What's our next cornerstone?
Chris, preserve wildness and natural conditions.
That's such a simple sounding phrase. Perhaps you'd better start by explaining what you mean by wildness and natural conditions.
Starting with wildness, you can have areas that could have been mined, they could have roads within them, they could have been used for any of a variety of purposes. But the current designation as wilderness means that we are going to manage them for wildness as a value. We made a decision not to manipulate it further.
The Wilderness Act talks about the earth and its community of life being untrammeled by man. That's what we're talking about.
Untrammeled by man means that we are making a conscious decision to let nature be the primary force in that area.
Good. Now, what do you mean by natural conditions?
Natural conditions really means that you're trying to manage for the community of life, the relationships between all of the plants and animals in the area will be the primary focus of the management.
And that's difficult increasingly, isn't it? Ecological systems free from the effects of modern technological civilization. The pressures that we're feeling in this ever-shrinking area.
Absolutely true. If you take the kind of situation that we're in here in Southern California, it's perhaps some of the most difficult terrain to work with, both because of the natural setting. We're in a very inhospitable desert with, in a good year, 2 to 3 inches of rain. And at the same time, we're in an area that is under lots of social pressures. There's development coming in from all directions. Some of the connectivity that might have existed that was part of the forces of nature that went on perhaps centuries ago, some of that has changed. So we're trying to work with a system that is, in a very large regional sense, somewhat altered, and still trying to make sure that we're keeping those forces of nature and those wilderness values, that wildness, intact.
But what happens if some human action in the past has so degraded natural conditions that an area won't recover simply by doing nothing?
Well, that really, I think, then takes you to looking at what your options are. In some cases, your best answer may be to do passive restoration, to basically leave it alone, watch it, see what's happening, see if the system essentially recuperates on its own. There may be other circumstances where it requires an active hand to get in, change the circumstances, either so that the use that is affecting the area changes, or so that you hold on to some essential natural value that was part of why the wilderness was designated in the first place.
So what you're talking about is a short-term trammeling of the wilderness. You're losing a bit of wildness by going in and manipulating the area to have a long-term positive effect on the naturalness of the area.
By its very nature, if you're going to do something fairly aggressive, it should be approached with caution, because you want to be careful that you're not trammeling an area without being very, very careful about why it is necessary to do that, and very, very cautious about where or how much of that you might do. And I think the key would be, what is at risk? You know, what do you have to work with? What are your priorities? Where are your trade-offs?
And so it seems that we're talking about a problem in a particular wilderness. A solution might be different between wildernesses, even if the problem is somewhat related.
Absolutely true, and I would even go so far as to say it's probably going to be true in most cases. You're going to have different forces socially on an area in terms of proximity to other kinds of land uses that might have effects into the wilderness. You're going to have different sets of natural systems. You're going to have different communities of life, different assemblages of species, their responses to different kinds of restoration techniques or approaches. All of those things create a very complex picture, and that's why it has to be approached carefully.
So we'd follow a Hippocratic oath of restoration. First, do no harm, and then once you're there, you try to improve both the wildness and the natural conditions over time.
Absolutely. I mean, you really have to change your thinking in a way. You're not trying to get to a result necessarily in 2 years or 3 years. You're trying to deliver a result of wildness and naturalness out 50 years and 100 years and even beyond.
Let's look at an example of what we're striving for in this balance between wildness and natural conditions.
What we have here is what used to be a pretty well-used vehicle route. And we were trying to find a way to say, this isn't a vehicle route anymore. This is wilderness. And the crew, the Student Conservation Association, did a good job of blending in with the kind of rock pavement that you see across this whole hillside.
They did a great job. Now, you could have made the decision that, no, we're going to have this area be strictly wild and let this route degrade over time by nature's own process. What would have happened if you'd done that?
Well, I think the primary disadvantage of that is that I think we would then be fighting the tendency to use it as a vehicle route out into the future.
Well, this road rehabilitation is a rather simple example. Can you think of something that's a little more complicated, that dynamic between preserving wildness and natural conditions? A little more complicated than just a road rehab?
Well, here in Southern California, probably the most obvious example is water for bighorn sheep. We're in a situation where some of the areas where 100 or 200 years ago that the sheep might have watered or moved through, those aren't available to the sheep anymore. If they normally would have watered in an area outside the wilderness that is no longer available to them, where will they water? And what is the proximity of that water to escape cover and forage that they rely upon?
And other laws might be brought into the mix too, mightn't they?
We deal with many, many listed species under the Endangered Species Act, and we have a very potent mandate there to perpetuate those species out into the future. And so we need to think about that as we look at what do we need to do, and doing nothing may not be acceptable for a given species.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for helping us understand the complex dynamic in trying to steward an area that is both wild and has natural conditions. Preserve wildness and natural conditions.